Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back at you again with another historical video. And today we're continuing on in our A-push journey and period 7. I know I messed up yesterday by saying period 6, or a couple days ago by saying it was period 6. Period 7, one of the largest years in a period. From what is that, 1898 to 1945, or 1890 to 1940? 55 years. It's a long time, people. So here we have, I just want to say 1890 to 1945. All right, let's get into it. Chapter 21. America and the Great War. So this, again, this might be a little review for you, especially from last year in world history when you learned about World War I. But again, this is United States history. So we're going to look at the United States and their involvement in the war. So yeah, it should sound familiar. I hope. All right, so before we get started, let's give a little more background, a little more of Teddy Roosevelt in his big stick diplomacy. He once famously said, "Speak softly and carry a big stick." That's where this big stick comes from. America in the World, 1901 to 1917. So Roosevelt said there are civilized and uncivilized nations, and the civilized nations could intervene in uncivilized nations, basically meaning like Western nations like United States, France, Great Britain, Germany, could intervene in uncivilized nations like, Cuba, the Philippines, South Africa, India, China. So Japan and Russia, those who had me in world history, y'all know about this. Japan and Russia fight in the Russo-Japanese War in 1905. And if you remember, Japan humiliated Russia with their superior navy, and Russia being, the largest country in the world. It really showed their backwardness when the fighting came to a front. Japan will secretly ask Teddy Roosevelt helped reach the peace agreement. I said that yesterday, or in the last lecture. Teddy Roosevelt will win the Nobel Peace Prize in 1906. Not mentioned in your book, but it's good to know, is this 1906 San Francisco School Board incident where the San Francisco School Board segregated Asian students into a different school. And tensions between the U.S. and Japan are going to boil, they're going to mount. And so Teddy Roosevelt and Japan reached this gentleman's agreement, a man of your word, you never go back on it. Japan would stop immigrants from coming to the U.S. by withholding their passports. And yet again, this is another example of nativism, which is kind of running rampant around this time period. So here you have Tsar Alexander the Third. No, Nicholas. Who am I? Get it right, Nicholas. And so he's staring down Russian prestige, and it's one of those, sand clocks, and the prestige is going down. The sand's running out. The Tsardom was badly shaken by its war with Japan. And there's Teddy Roosevelt again. All right. So what's more associated with Teddy is his Roosevelt corollary, the Monroe Doctrine. At this time, remember, Monroe Doctrine is basically saying European nations get out of Latin America. Western Hemisphere is closed for colonization. Well, Great Britain and Germany have a lot of money owed to them by Latin American countries. And Teddy feared that they would become involved violating the Monroe Doctrine, which, you know, they don't want to go to war with their homies because, I mean, I'm not saying they're their homies, but they're very vital trade partners, especially Great Britain. And so they don't want to go to war with them. So he proclaims this Roosevelt corollary. In future financial instances, the U.S. would intervene and pay off those debts. So the impact of this corollary speech, the U.S. would now become heavily involved in Latin America, and there's going to be a lot of resentment from Latin American nations, Latin American peoples, because they didn't ask for America to stick their nose in their business. Speaking of sticking their nose in their business, you have the Panama Canal event, where the canal was vital to be built for U.S. interests. It would cut down travel time for shipping and military, sending troops. Because if you wanted to send something from New York City or even from Florida, you wanted to get it to California, Arizona, Nevada, okay, you would have to sail. And, this is around the time of, railroads and railroad companies kind of being tough with their prices. So you'd send it via ship. However, the thing was, the shipments had to go from Florida, New York, all the way down the coast of South America, and then go back up north along the west coast of South America to the west coast of the United States. That took about, 13 days, 2 weeks? If you could cut through Panama, you cut like 5 days from it. So it was very, very vital, very important that the U.S. get a hold, get a grasp, get it created. So you're going to have this thing called the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty in 1901, which gave the U.S. the right to build the canal and a right to fortify it. Colombia, who was then, had land claims in Panama, rejected this treaty to give the U.S. the right to build. So in good old American fashion, Teddy Roosevelt and the United States government influenced a rebellion in Colombia / Panama. And that's basically going to guarantee Panama independence from Colombia. And then the U.S. government will have free reign to create this Panama Canal. So here's the Roosevelt corollary, Teddy Roosevelt in his ship saying Monroe Doctrine. He's got this gun pointed at the king. It looks like is that sitting on the toilet? This is Europe, and this is the Republic of Santo Domingo. And he's saying, get out. And here's Teddy Roosevelt patrolling the Caribbean Sea. The big stick, Santo Domingo, Cuba, Mexico, Panama, Venezuela, and he's pulling around all his ships with his big stick. And here he is when the canal was being built. He's wearing a white suit, kind of looks like that guy from Jurassic Park, just sitting there. I think he's attempting to use this machine. I think that's a crane. All right, so continuing on, dollar diplomacy. This is Taft's, you can say Taft's policies, where Wall Street bankers, not the U.S. government, Wall Street, would encourage to invest in areas of strategic concern to the United States. So that's going to help other countries while it's going to make money for the United States. Wilson and we're going to move on from Wilson, the next president, and he's going to have a lot of issues in Mexico. So many U.S. companies had financial interests in Mexico, and Mexico is going through their revolution. We talked about last year how they gained independence from Spain. Now, basically a century later, they're going to have their own revolution. Leaders are going to rotate and change very drastically, and they're going to want to, nationalize some industries, which is going to lose money for Americans. And you have a guy named Pancho Villa who's going to plan his own rebellion and was furious. He was kind of good buddies with Wilson before he planned his own rebellion, and he was furious that Wilson lost his faith in Pancho Villa and abandoned support for Pancho Villa. So that's going to piss him off. So he's going to go on a raid in Mexico and in New Mexico. Yeah, I think it's New Mexico. And he's going to kill about 10 to 15 Americans. So the military, and you might remember this from the World Wars DVD last year, but General John Pershing will cross into Mexico hunting Villa and his banditos, and sadly will never find him. And they get pulled away because something else goes on in Europe. As Pancho Villa, if you find him, let the United States government know. He's dead. Anyways, the road to war. So, World War I breaks out in 1914, right? So, again, I know you guys might know this, but just to refresh you, the Allied powers were Britain, France, and Russia, later United States. The Central Powers made up of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. And the causes of World War I are, you can make an acronym for MAIN, or the main causes of World War I were caused by militarism, building up of armies. The alliance system, remember, you had the Triple Alliance and Triple Entente before the war, and the secret alliances. Imperialism, big, and nationalism, everyone wanting to prove their worth. It all starts when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was killed June 28th, 1914. And that's it. Him and his wife, remember? Him and his wife. So at the start, Wilson had urged neutrality because, we were big trading partners with Britain and France. We were making money. But then Germany did their thing and called for unrestricted submarine warfare. And they kind of had the submarine market clamped down. So we weren't ready for it. Germany will sink all enemy ships without letting them know. You have the Lusitania incident, where the British liner, the Lusitania, was sunk off the coast of, I think, Ireland. 128 Americans died. You have the French ship, the Sussex, was sank by another German U-boat, which led to the Sussex Pledge, where Germany pledged not to sink ships without a warning first. So remember, they would come to the top of the water. I don't know why I can't think of that word. Give the warning, like, hey, we're going to blow up this ship. And it would give, 5, 10, 15 minutes maybe for people to evacuate the boat, because they were then going to blow it up. So in the election of 1916, Wilson was reelected because, hey, he kept us out of the war. But then the Zimmerman telegram happens, where, if you remember, Germany urged Mexico to attack the United States, and Mexico will get the land back that they lost in the Mexican-American War. The note, along with Germany reinstituting some unrestricted submarine warfare on the West Coast, on the East Coast of the United States, brought the U.S. into the war. So April 2nd, 1917, Wilson asked for a declaration of war. So that's the Lusitania. That's the Sussex ship. The Lusitania, remember, it was thought that they were carrying munitions, guns, butter, all that, weapons. At first, it was said they weren't, but come to find out they were. And here's that land that they wanted back: Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada. Was that Utah, Colorado? If I remember my states. Okay, so Russia withdrew from the war in 1918. Do you remember the treaty? You said the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. You're right. And in that treaty, Lenin gave up a significant amount of land to the Germans, and it allowed the Germans to stop fighting in a two-front war and focus solely on the Western Front. In America, the national draft was instituted. It was the first time since the Civil War. And if you remember the other national draft, that caused the New York City draft riots. So just some comparisons. 3 million men would be drafted. There was an extra 2 million volunteered. So now you have a total of 5 million, because that's 3 plus 2, in the American Expeditionary Force, AEF. Women could enlist, although they couldn't fight in combat. So, they were nurses, Red Cross. 400,000 African Americans were enlisted. And remember W.E.B. Du Bois, who was against, assimilation, all that. He hoped that African Americans serving in the Army, serving in the Navy, would help improve African American status. So he was pro-war. If you have someone who's being an advocate for African American rights, if he was one of the main leaders, NAACP, he's gonna have some influence, and that's gonna lead to some African Americans joining the war. If you remember, this is the first time trench warfare makes its beginnings. And remember, there's no man's land on each side of the trenches. You didn't want to be caught out in no man's land because you could die. This is the war where poisonous gas and flamethrowers were instituted, as well as airplanes, tanks. We know these things. There was a lot of casualties, a lot of death in World War I, and especially caused from, the Spanish flu, because you should know about flus, right? So this is a map of trenches. Ooh. And so, what was it told? Like the amount of trenches dug in World War I and World War II, or was it just World War I? The amount you could, the amount dug could travel the entire globe. Even though, you got these little juts, these little turns. There's a lot of, it was a trench network. It was a trench network. And remember, they were unsanitary and foul, stinky. You got dead people just rotting away. Not a good time. So again, the war and American society. How was the war financed? Through Liberty bonds. You buy from the federal government and you can return this bond after said many years with interest. Also, income taxes. Remember, the 16th Amendment is a graduated income tax, the government no longer looking to make money off tariffs. So income taxes. Herbert Hoover, I forget what, he's like the Secretary of the Navy, Secretary of War. He's going to rely heavily on volunteers and rationing. You have the National War Labor Board was created. It was created to resolve labor disputes because This is around the time where unions are starting to flex their muscles and they're going to go on strike. And, you didn't want to go on strike. Unions would be seen as like un-American. And speaking of unions, you have the IWW we talked about last time, the Industrial Workers of the World. They were nicknamed the Wobblies or the I Won't Work, and that they're going to like sabotage factories because, as we start producing necessary goods for the war, munitions, guns, tanks. If you're sabotaging factories, like that's not good. You're sabotaging the war effort. You also have the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, led by Samuel Gompers, and he's going to favor the war. Membership for the AFL will heavily increase during this time. As well, American society will be affected by the Great Migration. There are two Great Migrations, one during World War I and one during World War II. And that's the mass movement of African Americans from the South to the industrial North looking for higher paying jobs. So New York, Chicago, Cleveland, all looking for that money. Because as you saw, 5 million people vacated the jobs. So you need 5 more million people to get hired to continue the work that they were doing. You also have something called the Red Summer, and those are the race riots in 1919 caused by the Great Migration. Whites weren't ready for African Americans to just move in willy-nilly, and there are going to be some race riots. Innocent African Americans will be killed, and blacks and whites are going to fight against each other. So that's Herbert Hoover, future president. And this is the Great Migration, also going to St. Louis. And they're all they're looking for jobs, looking for a better way of life. Isn't that the American dream? So the futile search for social unity, you have this Committee on Public Information, and this is kind of the way that, I don't want to call it propaganda, but support for the war was heavily influenced by this Committee on Public Information. The leader was George Creel, and he sent out pro-war material. Him and his associates were called 4-Minute Men, where they would go around city to city giving 4-minute speeches, hyping up the war and getting people to support the war and the war effort at home. Rationing foods, if you could donate some goods that could be melted down, like pots and pans that could be melted down to make bullets or other things that help build tanks. Anything and everything can help. Buy Liberty bonds. Grow your own victory garden, right? Although victory gardens are more World War II. And he's also going to have newspapers promote self-censorship. Then you have these two acts, the Espionage Act of 1917, who prosecuted anti-war individuals, and this was upheld by the Supreme Court case Schenck versus the United States in 1919. Remember, Eugene V. Debs is the leader of the Socialist Party, ran for president 3 times. He would be convicted and he would be sentenced to jail for 10 years. You also have the Sedition Act of 1918, which strengthened the Espionage Act, and that also restrict the free speech and ability to criticize the government. And if that sounds any familiar, about almost 100 so odd years ago from this time period, the Alien and Sedition Acts after the Revolutionary War. Remember that? You remember. Immigrants are going to be mostly targeted, especially German Americans. And this is where the United States are going to change some foods that came from like Germans. Like, so instead of sauerkraut, they called it Liberty cabbage. So who's this? This is, that's George Creel. And I believe that's Eugene V. Debs. Or that was the Schenck guy. All right, so 14 points. We know about the 14 points. Paris Peace Conference, PPC, TOV, Treaty of Versailles. And it was Wilson's plans for the post-war worlds, you know, the ideas of self-determination, no secret alliances, freedom of the seas, free trade, and ultimately his brainchild, the 14th point, the most important, the creation of association called the League of Nations. And they would, it's a world organization that would be committed to solve disputes. The U.S. Senate liked it, but they heavily disliked this Article 10, Article X, which called for members to give assistance to others if needed. And the Senate believed this would take away Congress's war-declaring powers, and it would end the era of isolation. And remember, at this time, also because Russia pulls out of World War I, or the Great War, as it was called back then, they have the Russian Civil War. It's the Reds versus the Whites, communists versus the loyalists to the Tsar. Wilson and the United States supported the Whites, and that's only going to create tensions between the United States and then the created Soviet Union. The Soviet Union wouldn't be recognized by the U.S. until 1933. And if you remember that from world history, you know, being recognized by a foreign power, a legit power, would make you seem legit yourselves. And it's going to take, well, I think the Civil War ends in 1923, 1925, 1921. So, you know, they go a decade until the United States recognizes them and Stalin's Soviet Union. Okay, so to ratify or not, and the main opponent of this treaty, the 14 points, was led by Henry Cabot Lodge, who was a Republican senator, who's very much against the treaty. He's going to write his own 14 reservations, his opinions about the 14 points. And again, he's going to say many senators did not like Article 10. So in order to, you know, kind of gain the country's support for the 14 points, Wilson's going to go on a speaking tour across the country, trying to, you know, kind of like bypass the senators' voices. And then you have the senators who were against the creation of this League of Nations. They are called the irreconcilables, and they're going to follow his tour and speak out against it. So there's a lot of dispute, and ultimately it's going to lead to the Senate never ratifying the treaty. Although it was still created, it was still held, it was still organized. The United States, the president who creates the League of Nations, the government does not ratify it. So therefore, we don't join the League of Nations, even though it was created by our president. Sad, man, sad. Oh, I didn't take these off. All right, so you have society in turmoil after the war. You have this post-war recession from 1919 to 1920. It's also called the year of the strikes, 1919. Strikes at this time are going to be heavily associated with radicalism, Bolshevism, or AKA communism. Massachusetts governor and future president Calvin Coolidge was critical of these strikes. You're kind of seen as un-American, you know, if you're striking. African Americans, sadly, W.E.B. Du Bois, we let you down. They didn't get rights after the fighting. And parades were, you know, celebrating the Allied powers. African Americans were banned from joining these parades. And that was in Europe. Again, the Red Summer, race riots, 1919, especially in Chicago. Big, big, big. And then you also have a guy named Marcus Garvey, who's going to promote Black nationalism in his organization called the United Negro Improvement Association, the UNIA, and they're going to promote this back to Africa movement because, you know, we're not getting rights here, so let's just go back to our native homeland, and we'll fit in there. We'll have our own rights. So I need to edit this a little bit better. All right, so you have the Red Scare of 1919, 1920. This is the first Red Scare. Again, we're going to have a second Red Scare shortly. Is it shortly after? Yeah, shortly after World War II. So kind of they kind of repeat. They kind of switch up the cycles. There will be a crusade led by Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer, who will use the CIA to use the Espionage Act to find out information against suspected communists. Thousands upon thousands of Americans were to be arrested. Only 3 guns were discovered. The impact of the Red Scare, business people used it as a help to break unions up. And we can't talk about the Red Scare without Sacco and Vanzetti, nativism. 2 Italian immigrants who were labeled as anarchists, atheists, draft dodgers were charged with a murder because it was the same type of gun, same type of bullets that I believe Sacco owned. And so both of them, because they were immigrants, not just because of the crime they supposedly committed, they were quickly found out guilty just because they were immigrants and they were labeled anarchists and atheists. Because remember, nativism is still going on. Racism, nativism, whatever you want to call it, whatever dress you want to name it. All right, they would be found guilty and quickly executed. Again, this is going to show tensions between immigrants and nativists across the country. Where's the proof, right? And just because it was of who they were and not for the crime they committed, really makes you think about things, right? And then you have the election of 1920, which Warren G. Harding will win, and the progressive era will sadly come to an end. And he vainly won and was elected because of his, quote, platform, a return to normalcy. And we kind of need some normalcy here, but that's a different thing. But, you know, a return to normalcy, meaning all the progressive movements had caused these strikes to go on, these race riots, getting involved in a war, not joining a post-war organization. That was all caused by the progressives. So we just need some normalcy. We need to stick to ourselves, work on ourselves a little bit, and just be isolated from the world on foreign terms. So because America, they needed to fix themselves a little bit during the 1920s. So here you have A. Mitchell Palmer, Sacco and Vanzetti, or Vanzetti and Sacco, whichever one. That's Warren G. Harding, the next president. All right. That concludes this lecture. Hopefully it was another kind of review for you in regards to some information that we've already talked about. So I hope that was refreshing for you and you're like, oh yeah, I remember that. So yeah, if you enjoyed that, make sure you smash that like button for your boy. And as always, stay safe, wash your hands. Peace.